The red light of a camera doesn't just signal a recording. It acts as a high-voltage current, charging the air until every breath feels heavy. In the heart of the studio, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a disaster, sharp, cold, and expectant. Before we dive into the moment the political script was torn to shreds, make sure you are positioned for every update. If you value clarity over choreography, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment below. Tell us, do you prefer a leader with a polished explanation or a straight answer? Your engagement ensures these stories of accountability reach the people who need them most. Now let's step into the room where the dodging stopped. The tension didn't start with raised voices. It started with the absence of them. Across the polished mahogany of the panel table, Caroline Leavitt sat with a composure that bordered on the statuesque. Her hands were folded, her spine a straight line of disciplined intent. She didn't look like someone preparing for a debate. She looked like someone waiting for a confession. Opposite her, Hakeem Jeffries leaned back, a posture designed to project ease. He wore the practiced half-smile of a man who had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of legislative jargon. To him, this was routine. A few talking points, a bit of procedural fog, and a graceful exit to the next fundraiser. He had survived 1,000 such exchanges by simply being the most articulate person in the room. The moderator, a man whose career was built on maintaining a polite equilibrium, lobbed a familiar question about a controversial vote. It was a softball in political circles, an opening for Jeffries to recite the narrative. He began smoothly, his voice a melodic baritone. He spoke of evolving landscapes, procedural frameworks, and the broader horizon of equity. It was a masterpiece of linguistic gymnastics. He expanded the premise outward, taking the audience on a tour of everything except the specific question asked. It was the kind of answer that sounded substantial until you realized it hadn't actually touched the ground. Caroline didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes or offer the performative smirk that usually defines televised politics. She simply watched him. That stillness was the first thing that unsettled the room. Politicians are trained to handle pushback, but they are terrified of patience. When Jeffries finally finished, he leaned back, satisfied that the clock had been sufficiently drained. The pause that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the moderator to reach for his notes, thinking the segment was over. "Respectfully," Caroline said, her voice cutting through the studio hum like a blade through silk, "you didn't answer the question." The air in the studio didn't just chill, it solidified. The cameramen froze behind their lenses. Jeffrey's smile didn't vanish, but it thinned, becoming a translucent mask. He opened his mouth to rephrase, to offer another layer of context, but Caroline didn't give him the opening. "You explained why it's complicated," she continued, leaning just enough to reclaim the space. "You explained who you blame, but you didn't explain your role. You didn't explain your vote." The word "your" landed with a physical weight. In that moment, the routine panel discussion died. The choreography was over. The dismantling had begun. The silence following Caroline's opening strike wasn't just a lull in conversation. It was a vacuum. In the control booth, a producer barked a quiet order into the moderator's earpiece to keep it moving, but the moderator remained paralyzed. He could feel the shift. The routine had been replaced by a reckoning. Hakeem Jeffries adjusted his position, his elbows grazing the table as he leaned back into the light. The practiced half-smile returned, though it was tighter now, a defensive reflex. "Caroline," he began, using her first name with a paternalistic smoothness intended to de-escalate. "Government isn't a soundbite. We have to look at the legislative intent, the committee markups, and the shifting dynamics of the floor. To suggest a simple answer is to ignore the reality of how we serve the people." It was a classic retreat into the fog of process. Normally, this was where the opponent would pivot to their own platform, allowing the original question to die in the shadows. But Caroline didn't move. She didn't look for a safer ground of her own. "I'm not asking about intentions," she said, her voice dropping a half octave into a tone of absolute clarity. "I'm not asking about messaging. I'm asking about actions." She reached down into the folder in front of her. The movement was slow, deliberate, and devoid of the theatrical flourish usually seen on cable news. She lifted a single sheet of paper and placed it flat on the mahogany table between them. It looked small, but in the tight frame of the high-definition cameras, it looked like a mountain. "This is the vote," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Your vote." Jeffries glanced down, his eyebrows rising in a choreographed show of amusement. "We're not going to reduce complex, multi-layered legislation to a single—" "Read the date," Caroline interrupted. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, his hands hovering over his notes like he was trying to find a way to intervene without getting burned. "Let's be fair here. The context of that week was—" "I am being fair," turning to the moderator for a fraction of a second before locking back onto Jeffries. "I am being as fair as the voters who have to live with the result. Context doesn't pay the bills, and intent doesn't change the law of the land." She leaned in, her shadow falling across the paper she had placed between them. "You keep talking around the center, Hakeem, and every time you do, the answer you're avoiding gets louder in this room. It's a simple question of accountability. Yes or no? Do you stand by the specific provision on page 14 of this document?" The room froze. This was the binary trap. In the world of high-level politics, a yes is a target and a no is a betrayal of the party line. The only survival mechanism is the maybe, or it's complicated, but Caroline had walled off the exits. Jeffries exhaled through his nose, his posture stiffening as the smile finally evaporated. He looked toward the moderator, then at the camera, then finally at the woman across from him. The cameras stayed tight on his face, catching the hesitation, the flickering calculation of a man realizing that the usual pathways out of the question had been sealed shut. For the first time, he didn't look like a leader giving an explanation. He looked like a man trying to remember where he had left the keys to his own defense. In that pause, the audience, both in the studio and at home, understood exactly why she had said what she had said. He wasn't explaining. He was dodging. And the paper on the table was the only thing in the room that wasn't lying. The transition to a commercial break usually acts as a pressure valve, a moment for the combatants to wipe their brows and for the handlers to rush in with water and tactical whispers. But as the on-air light flickered out, the tension in the studio didn't dissipate. It curdled. The moderator didn't check his phone. He didn't joke with the floor director. He stared at his monitor, his face pale in the artificial glow. He could feel the weight of the segment, the heavy air that precedes a storm. Across the table, Hakeem Jeffries remained seated, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't looking at Caroline anymore. He was looking past her, his mind clearly scanning the mental Rolodex of party talking points, looking for a pivot that hadn't already been burned. A producer scurried onto the set, leaning into Jeffries' ear. The whisper was frantic, the kind of urgent tone used when a narrative is slipping through one's fingers. "We need to widen the lens," the producer hissed. "Talk about the caucus. Talk about the long-term vision. Don't let her keep you in the binary." Jeffries nodded, his jaw set. He was a creature of the long game, a man built for the marathon of governance, and he had just been forced into a sprint on a narrow track. Caroline, meanwhile, remained an island of stillness. She didn't check her makeup, she didn't look for validation from the small team she had brought with her. She simply sat, her eyes fixed on the sheet of paper she had placed on the table. To her, the paper wasn't a prop, it was the truth, and the truth didn't need a handler. When the red light flicked back on, the studio snapped into a silence so sharp it felt like a physical sting. Whatever the producers had planned during the break hadn't survived the mood shift. The moderator cleared his throat, his voice lacking its earlier practiced enthusiasm. "We're back," he said, his eyes darting toward the control booth. "Let's continue. Congressman, you were speaking about the broader context." Jeffries adjusted his jacket, forcing a calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice came out steady, but there was a new edge to it, a sharpness born of frustration. "What we're seeing here," he said, leaning forward to reclaim the space, "is a pattern of framing complex policy debates into personal accusations. That may make for effective television, Caroline, but it doesn't move the country forward. It doesn't put food on the table." It was a strong counter, a veteran's move. He was attempting to paint her precision as a gimmick, a gotcha moment designed for a digital clip. Caroline didn't react right away. She sat still, listening not just to his words, but to the rhythm of his deflection. When she finally spoke, her tone was quieter than it had been before the break, which only made the room lean in further. "Then let's stop framing and just talk plainly. You've said this conversation is about complexity, so let's test that. When a mother in your district asks you a direct question, 'Did this vote make my life harder?' what is the honest answer? Not the caucus answer, not the committee answer, the honest one." The audience in the shadows of the studio shifted. Someone let out a quiet breath. "There isn't a single answer," Jeffries replied, his voice tightening. "Different families experience policy differently. To suggest otherwise it's not a suggestion, it's a result. You defended the language of this bill earlier as a necessity, but here on page 22 is a provision that contradicts the very reassurance you just gave. If transparency matters, why is it so difficult to acknowledge the gap between what you promised and what you signed?" The moderator interjected, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "We're not here to litigate legislative process line by line." "No," said Caroline, her eyes locked on Jeffries, ignoring the moderator entirely. "We're here because people at home are tired of being told one thing and experiencing another. This is what off-script looks like. It's uncomfortable, but it's the only place where the truth actually lives." Jeffries leaned back, folding his arms. The heavy air had become an anchor. He was no longer debating a peer. He was standing under a spotlight that wouldn't let him turn away. For the first time in his career, the broader context felt like a very small place to hide. The clock on the studio wall was a silent executioner, its red digital numbers ticking toward the end of the broadcast. In most televised debates, the final minutes are a flurry of rehearsed closing statements, a rapid-fire exchange of slogans designed to leave a lasting, positive impression. But as the segment reached its crescendo, the energy in the room did the opposite. It slowed. It thickened. It became a vacuum where every word spoken felt like it was being weighed on a scale. The moderator, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, looked at his tablet with a mixture of dread and duty. "We'll take one final question before we wrap," he said, his voice straining for a brightness that wasn't there. "This comes from a viewer at home. They ask, who should be held responsible when promised outcomes don't materialize?" It was a simple question. In politics, simple questions are the most dangerous because they don't provide enough room for a pivot. Jeffries nodded slowly, a tactical move to buy himself a few seconds of cognitive space. He cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. "Responsibility in government is shared," he began, his voice returning to that resonant, authoritative baritone. "No single individual controls the full process. It's a collaboration of branches, committees, and stakeholders. That's why we focus on collective progress rather than—" Caroline didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. She didn't need to. This shared responsibility argument was the ultimate shield of the veteran politician, a way of saying that if everyone is responsible, then no one is. "Can I respond directly to that?" she asked. She didn't look at the moderator for permission. She looked at the camera, then back at Jeffries. She leaned forward, her elbows close to the table, mirroring his posture, but without the aggression. "You just heard a lot of words that sound reasonable," she said, her voice quiet, almost intimate. "Process, collaboration, shared responsibility. They are the vocabulary of Washington. But here is what the viewer actually asked. They didn't ask how the machine works. They asked who answers when it breaks." Jeffries' jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek. "And I answered that responsibility is collective," he snapped, the edge in his voice finally breaking through the polished veneer. "That's the dodge," Caroline said. The word didn't just land, it reverberated. Someone in the production crew audibly exhaled. The silence that followed was longer than anyone was comfortable with, a silence that felt like a verdict. Collective responsibility is useful for press conferences, but at the ballot box, there are names, there are records, there are votes. So I'll ask it plainly. When a policy fails to deliver what you promised on this stage, do you believe the voters have the right to know your name was on the yes list? Of course, Jeffries said, his voice lower now, tighter. Good, Caroline replied. Then why is it treated like an attack when I read your record out loud? The moderator raised a hand, a desperate reflex. Let's keep this constructive. It is constructive. Avoiding the record is what isn't. You say we should judge you by the broader goals. I say we should judge you by the results. Can you name one specific outcome from this policy, one that worked exactly as you promised it would? He opened his mouth, then stopped. He glanced at the moderator, then back at the paper on the table. For 3 seconds, the only sound in the studio was the hum of the cooling fans. It wasn't a long time, but in the world of live television, 3 seconds of silence is an eternity. It is the sound of a narrative collapsing. I think we need to evaluate the long-term impacts, he finally managed. Caroline nodded slowly, a gesture of quiet recognition. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She simply looked at the camera. That's not an answer, and the people watching at home know it. The red light dimmed, signaling the end of the segment, but the tension remained. The last thing the viewers saw wasn't a handshake or a smile. It was the unmistakable moment when a question was asked and the room realized it would never be answered. The studio lights dimmed with a mechanical hum, but the atmosphere remained charged, as if the air itself had been ionized by the exchange. Hakeem Jeffries remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the darkened lenses of the cameras. His public composure was a fortress, still standing but visibly weathered. Across from him, Caroline Leavitt stood up with the quiet efficiency of someone finishing a day's work. She didn't offer a victory lap, she didn't even offer a smile. She simply unclipped her microphone, the click of the plastic casing sounding like a gavel in the quiet room. "You're good at framing," Jeffries said quietly, his voice stripped of its oratorical resonance. It wasn't quite a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. It was an acknowledgement of a new reality. Caroline tilted her head slightly, her coat draped over her arm. "I'm good at asking what people at home are already thinking," she replied. "Politics isn't that simple," he countered, finally standing and straightening his jacket. "That's exactly why clarity matters," she said. As she walked toward the exit, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The record was already moving. By the time she reached the hallway, the digital echo had already begun. The sterile corridor, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale coffee, was no longer quiet. Staffers were huddled over glowing screens, their faces illuminated by the rapid-fire scroll of social media feeds. The moment, the 3 seconds of silence, the yes or no trap, the paper on the table, had already been severed from the broadcast and launched into the ether. In a black SUV blocks away, Jeffries watched the clip on his phone with the sound turned off. He didn't need the audio to understand the damage. He watched his own hesitation, frozen in a high-definition frame, replayed 10,000 times in the span of 10 minutes. He had given a correct answer by Washington standards, but the digital world didn't care about standards. It cared about the truth. The silence was doing more work than any headline ever could. Back at her desk, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows against the wall, Caroline watched the same footage. She wasn't looking for validation, she was looking for calibration. She noted the exact second the moderator tried to intervene and the exact moment Jeffries' jaw had tightened. She hadn't shut him down by being louder or more aggressive, she had shut him down by being immovable. The narrative had shifted. The pundits were no longer debating the policy, they were debating the dodge. They were asking why the question had been so hard to answer. They were looking into the mirror she had held up, and for the first time in a long time, they couldn't look away. As the sun began to break over the horizon, the political world woke up to a different landscape. Clips were being cut, headlines were being drafted, and the binary trap had become a blueprint. Caroline closed her laptop, the room finally falling into a true silence. She hadn't just won an argument, she had made it impossible for the conversation to ever return to the safety of the fog. The story of the dismantling serves as a stark reminder that in an age of rehearsed choreography, the most powerful tool is a simple, direct question held with unwavering discipline. When leaders are forced to stand still under the light of their own records, the truth ceases to be a matter of framing and becomes a matter of fact. If this deep dive into the psychology of political accountability resonated with you, don't let the conversation end here. Make sure to like this video and share it with someone who believes in the power of a straight answer. Comment below. Do you think collective responsibility is a valid defense, or is it just a way of avoiding the ballot box? Most importantly, subscribe. We are dedicated to stripping away the fog and bringing you the stories that demand clarity. Thank you for watching, and remember, the record never changes.